justice was served today was due to one person, a person that only knows how to give. She has given herself literally for free to this investigation in different ways since about March of 2017. Kathy Shank, while filing, scanning, organizing, found a tip that led us to be here today. Throughout this investigation, especially when things happened during the month, for things that happened during the month of 2017, that was a time when Kathy was not helping us. When she would come across something that she didn't know, she would always bring that to an investigator, and every time that she brought us something and said, "Did you know this?" we knew it, except for the tip that she brought us that got us here today.
I'm feeling very humble about this, and it's a team. It's not. Well, we're taking a team. It took a village. It took a village.
Day 6, October 24th, 2024, 9:07 a.m. Prosecutor Stacy Diener. The state calls Kathy Shank. Mrs. Shank. I'm from Florida originally. I've spent 40 years in Delphi. I was raised here. I'm very familiar with Carroll County. I attended Purdue University for 4 years and graduated in accounting in 1974. I worked for the Department of Child Services for 40 years, with a service area of Carroll County. I would work with law enforcement quite extensively. I retired in 2011 after 40 years, and in February of 2017 I was retired. I became involved in the investigation. I was in Florida when this horrible tragedy occurred, when I first heard the press conference. I had worked with Rob Ives, and I knew Rob well and contacted him. I volunteered from March 1st, 2017 up until the present time. I was helping. I was basically a receptionist. I was placed behind the counter. When a person came in with tips, I referred them to the lead detective. I passed info on through an information sheet. Name, identifying info, a little summary, and I took it upstairs for the detectives. Initially, there were numerous officers, cramped quarters. The REMC graciously offered to house us. My best guesstimate is a quantity of 50-plus law enforcement. Diener, do you have any idea who is working on what? Shank, no. Diener, did you take on more responsibility? Shank, I can't exactly remember who gave me additional work. There was an increase in investigative reports. I would arrange them in a way that would be easily accessible. I requested that they please get me a filing cabinet. I was asked to put the narrative summaries in and label them. Diener, did you know what was in them? Shank, I had no idea. I was directed not to get into the report narrative, just to look at the names. I had a quantity of 5 filing cabinets. They had multiple drawers and were metal. Diener, anything else you were directed to do with those folders? Shank, I was not the only one making folders. A friend of mine, Carol, she was also vetted, a background check. Law enforcement had worked with me for so many years. Things started to slow down a bit, and I thought I could be of more benefit labeling file folders and a receptionist at the REMC at the same time. It took me a while, but bankers' boxes were brought to me with the narrative reports. I entered the narrative summaries that were to be entered into a database. The narrative summaries were in a report. Diener, what were you doing? Shank, the database required sections. Diener, when the lead came in, how was it distinguished? Shank, each lead received a number. It was put in the database. Diener, were there cases outside of the Libby and Abby investigation? You entered the narratives into the database? Shank. Yes. Once we moved to the city building, there was quite a difference. I entered tips. Tips were forwarded to me. Tony Liggett and several officers received them. Tony said, "You can do this." He showed me how to enter in the database. The tip line emails were forwarded to me. We were moved to the city building by now. I was entering into a computer database. Generally, this was the unified command. There were different detectives on different days. Tony Liggett was the main go-to person. After a year, there were less law enforcement present to work. Shank. REMC versus the city building. Metal cabinets moved with me and still exist to this day. At that time, when I received tip info, it went into the database. I was asked to do more approximately September 2020, I'm going to guess. Tips were included in the other documents within the file folders that needed to be scanned in. Diener, how long did it take to scan that in? Shank, 2 years. We were in the city building, but we had to find another location. We moved again. The cabinets moved with me. It took 2 years to scan and put the information into the computer system. For the filing cabinet scans, the last time I looked, the database had 14,000 tips. I would volunteer and usually go in from 12:30 p.m. to 5:30 or 6 o'clock p.m., 5 days a week. After the filing cabinet scans were done, I worked on other things. We moved from the city building. I brought with me the material that needed to go to the detectives for review. I was going through a box when I noticed I was observing handwritten tip numbers. My concern was that they were handwritten. I didn't want to miss any tips. That's when I found a lead sheet. The lead sheet given to Dan Doolin on February 16, 2017. Richard Allen Whiteman had self-reported being out on the trails between 1:30 and 3:30 p.m. I had previously read that a young girl between that time had seen a man at the High Bridge. Diener, why was this a concern? Shank, it seemed like it was a possible correlation. I took the note to the filing cabinet and found the file labeled Richard Allen Whiteman. Diener, was there a significance to the box? Shank, I was helping. I don't know how that exact lead sheet came into that box. Diener, though you said you didn't start volunteering until the beginning of March 2017, that particular lead sheet was prior to March? Shank, the handwritten tip numbers were, yes. The handwritten tip numbers were performed prior to me volunteering. The Richard Allen Whiteman tip narrative summary was entered prior to me in February 2017. Richard Allen had been entered and he lived on Whiteman. It correlated, something that related to this tip. I had no lead narrative. It had the word cleared written on it. It was not my job to decide if someone was cleared. No. The documents I found, I believe Tony was chief deputy. I took this info to Tony. It wasn't ever brought back to the filing cabinet. September 21st, 2022 was the date that I found it, and I remember that because it is my deceased husband's birthday. Diener, may I approach? Do you recognize these images? Exhibit 228. Diener confirms the picture of a manila file folder and your notes written on it. Are they accurately reflected? The 2 pages you found September 21st, 2022? The file folder you found in the box? It was 9:41 a.m. With his reading glasses perched on top of his head, Richard Allen is shaking his head no while watching Baldwin reviewing the documents beside him. Cross-examination. Baldwin: You have no idea what information that is on there is accurate, do you? Shank: I wasn't privy. Diener: Objection, calls for speculation. Baldwin: There was a mistake in this case. There is no Richard Allen Whiteman. Shank: I don't know. It wasn't me. Baldwin: Someone made a mistake from Dan Doolin. The initial entry says cleared Richard Allen Whiteman. Diener: Objection, ask and answer. Baldwin: Details matter. You're an organizer. You worked at... In the old days, we called it welfare. Shank: DCS. Baldwin: The Orion on the 3rd page. Do you know? Basically, a database, a place you were putting info. I'm a little confused. At that point of time, you were putting tips into Orion. Shank: Tips coming in through the Abby and Libby tip line. They would come in through email. I was privy to receiving them on my work email. I call them narrative summaries. I entered them in Orion. They were received by law enforcement and given to me to enter into a certain section of the database. I would literally enter it by typing it in. Baldwin: Orion tips and narratives. Shank: That is not a tip. There is a hierarchy. A tip is deemed a lead, and then a report is made, called a narrative summary, and then it is entered into the database. Baldwin: You did see thousands of tips. To your knowledge, no other tip was taken for Richard Allen Whiteman or Richard Allen? Shank: No. A girl had seen a man at approximately the same place and time that Richard Allen had self-reported. Baldwin: Did she describe him as muscular? Time, place, and date? Shank: I wasn't looking at that. It seemed to be the same place, time, and date. He self-reported it was the same. Please note, I observe that male juror number 6 is taking lots of notes and very involved in the testimony. Baldwin: The phone number on page 2, Richard Allen Whiteman. The name was wrong for the phone number? Shank: Inaudible. I was just putting names on the files. Lots of different agencies were involved. Carroll County, the Delphi Police Department, the Indiana State Police, and the FBI. On February 16, 2017, a handwritten tip lead sheet is given to Conservation Officer Dan Doolin. On February 18th, Doolin interviews Richard Allen and completes a narrative summary report. March 1st, 2017, volunteer Kathy Shank begins helping law enforcement. On September 21st, 2022, Kathy Shank discovers the handwritten tip lead in a box. She then goes to the cleared narrative summary files in the filing cabinet and locates Richard Allen Whiteman. On October 26, 2022, Delphi resident Richard Allen is arrested for the murders of Libby and Abby. Shank: I was not in the main room originally. I was downstairs. I would go upstairs and ask the detective to come down. Baldwin: Was the FBI in the... Diener: Objection, ask and answer. She would not have direct knowledge. She already said. Shank: Last time I actually looked, it was 14,000. I know there were 14,000 not too long ago. Baldwin: Some tips would be, this guy looks like my neighbor, or I think he looks like Bridge Guy. Shank: Yes. Baldwin: Do you remember if he had brown hair, curly hair? Shank: Sir, I have so many tips. Baldwin: You would remember someone with mud and blood. Shank: Inaudible. Baldwin: September 21st, 2022. Mr. Liggett was running for sheriff? Diener, objection outside of the scope. Note: Richard Allen is looking at the jury. He has his hand on his mouth with the blue pen in his hand, and he pulls his reading glasses down. Baldwin: Richard Allen self-reported. Diener: Did you do that from the very beginning? Shank: I didn't begin until the move to the city building. There were many tips. We were at the REMC a year or so and then moved to the city building. Diener: You did not go back? Shank: Oh no, there were many. Diener: The roadblock tip. Would you have been given that tip? Shank: It's difficult to remember. It was so long ago. Baldwin: To your knowledge, Richard Allen came forward to assist in the investigation? Diener: Objection calls for speculation. This is the end of Shank's testimony. Jury question number 1. Ma'am, how did you determine the name was inconsistent? Shank: The narrative summary. Being from this area, I knew there was a Whiteman Drive.